Hi and welcome. I'm Bill Cavanaugh. I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University, and I am here with Alejandra Oliva, the author of Rivermouth, a book that has been acclaimed since it was released in 2023. Welcome, Alejandra.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
So tell us a little bit about the title of the book, Rivermouth, and I believe the subtitle is Narratives of...
The Chronicle of Language, Faith, and Migration.
Thank you.
We had so many discussions about the subtitle and whether it sounded too academic or not academic enough, so it was a consensus process across a couple of different people.
Okay, wonderful. Well, yeah, the subtitle is where you throw all of the elements in, but the title is the grabber. What does Rivermouth mean? What's the significance?
Yeah, when I started writing the book, I think the main metaphor kind of at the heart of it, and is still very much a part of the book, was the idea of a river, the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, as a sort of... obviously, the actual physical geographical border between U.S. and Mexico for, I think, 2/3 of the border, something like that. It's all of Texas and maybe a little bit of New Mexico. But also as this place of meeting between two cultures, as both an actual geographic site and also very much a metaphor. And that river is one that flows kind of from the southern Rocky Mountains south across New Mexico and then sort of makes the bottom of Texas look the way it does, and empties out into the Gulf of Mexico at Brownsville, Texas, which is where my grandmother was born. And so I had both this idea of like an actual river mouth, a very fertile place, cradle of civilizations kind of a thing, and also this idea of being river-mouthed, which is to say a kind of speech, a kind of language that mixes freshwater and saltwater, that is a hybridization, a mingling of all of the influences that any particular river has passed through, that any particular person has passed through in their lives. You know, the little turns of phrase that you picked up from your mom or your best friend growing up that are still sort of part of your vocabulary, your accent, the languages you know, the languages you feel comfortable kind of mashing together into one messy, beautiful hybrid of a thing. And so, yeah, that's where the title comes from.
So the mouth has to do not just with the river, but with the language and the question of translation, because you went to the border as a translator. First of all, can you talk a little bit about translation? What did you learn about the act of translation? What's lost in translation? What's gained in translation? How do you think about translation?
Yes. So I became a translator kind of by accident. I had been looking for a way to volunteer, to get involved right after Trump got elected the first time. And I have known English and Spanish since I was a very small child. I did kind of little kid language brokering, not necessarily for my family, but like for friends around. Like it was always something that I could kind of rely on, but it was usually a very like casual, non-essential part of the way that I used language. And it was always Spanish at home, English out in the world. And so I ended up finding a pro se asylum clinic, which is for people who were not able to find legal representation, but that they could still fill out asylum forms and have somebody look over them, be able to like navigate the system with a little bit of assistance. And they were like, hey, we really need bilingual people. We really need interpreters. Can you do this work? And I was like, I guess so. I speak both languages. Like, we'll see what happens. And I found it such a rich exercise. And so much of my Spanish is also very homey in the sense of like, that's what my vocabulary is. Early on when the book came out, I had to do a couple of interviews for it in Spanish. And I was like, oh, this is like pushing the limits of my vocabulary in some interesting ways. Like, I don't talk about this book in Spanish, even though so much of it is about the relationship between Spanish and English. So when I first started doing this interpretation work, it was also so, like, it was vocabulary that I wasn't used to. I was also working with people mostly from Central America, and Central American Mexican Spanishes are a little bit different. So I'd have to be like, wait, hold on, time out. Like, I need you to explain this turn of phrase to me. I need you to explain this idiom. Like, I don't know what that means actually. And in doing that, you kind of start building a rapport with someone because they're like, oh, they're taking me seriously enough to ask like what this weird little phrase I used meant. They're taking my words and my language seriously. They're listening to me. And I was also getting to hear and learn very particularly people's stories about why they had fled their home countries, why they were applying for asylum, why they felt like they needed the legal protection of the United States to keep themselves safe. And in translating it, I was not only sort of listening to it, but I was also passing it through myself in a way. Someone would say, I left my country because of this in Spanish, and I would turn to the other people in the group and say, I left my country because of this in English. And like, it wasn't happening to me. It didn't happen to me, but it still hits you in a certain kind of way to pass it through the first person, to say something like that is so far from your own experiences, but still kind of embody it and put it into your own language. And so I think that there was something about doing translation in this setting specifically that really made me stop to think about, like, what is this process that I'm undergoing? What is translation really? What am I doing when I do this work? And that was kind of what got me started in thinking a lot about translation, thinking about power and power imbalances in the translation relationship and sort of who I was translating for and who I was helping when I was doing this work. And I think that's kind of where the book came from.
Okay, so part of the power imbalance then is that all of this has to be done eventually in English. I mean, the stories that you're told are in Spanish, but they have to be rendered into English for the purposes of the government. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And so, as the interpreter, you're the person in the room that speaks both languages, so you kind of have power over the conversation, but you're also negotiating the power difference between English, which is this U.S. government's language. It's the language in which their story will get, quote unquote, judged as to its credibility, as to its sort of applicability for asylum. And meanwhile, this person is communicating with you in Spanish, which is sometimes the only language they know, sometimes one of two languages that they know, the other one being an indigenous language. And you're kind of negotiating between all these things and trying to figure out the best way through that gives the person the most agency and power possible, while also being like, I am ultimately literally taking the words out of your mouth and putting them into someone else's, because this person has the ultimate deciding power, or this entity has the ultimate deciding power over what your life looks like.
Yeah, right. Wow. And so we think of, to return to the river as this kind of both reality and metaphor. We think of this as the natural kind of dividing line between the U.S. and Mexico, but it really wasn't until the 1840s, right? Because it was, Texas was Mexico until much, and I guess the 1840s, right? And so,
Yes.
and half of the U.S. kind of western states were part of Mexico at the same time, too. So the border has moved, and the border is kind of constantly changing in that way. Your family has some history in kind of both sides of the border. Is that right? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my grandmother was born in Brownsville, and she had an Anglo father, but she had an Anglo mother and father, but her father's family was, I believe his mother was Mexican and his father was Anglo. And so going back down that particular branch of the family, you kind of see generation over generation, people are born on one side of the border, get married on another, pass away. back at home or still in Mexico. Like, just kind of, people are very much treating the border as porous, and you can see it like even on census documents that like they're going back and forth from one side to the other. Sometimes they'll have marriage documents to the same person on both sides of the border. Like, there will be a Texas version of a document and a Mexican version of a document. And so you kind of see this fluidity and turning and returning. And so when my grandmother was born in Brownsville, her father is a GI, and he can't find work when he gets back from World War II. And they end up moving to Mexico when my grandmother is, I believe, 8 years old. And she has lived in Mexico ever since. But I think it's really significant when you're thinking about like these big migration stories that, at least for one part of my family, the migration that meant economic security, prosperity, stability meant moving to Mexico, when I feel like so often we are hearing it the other way around, especially lately.
Right. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So the porosity of the border is something that's always in negotiation, I suppose. We tend to think of it as being this kind of hard. I remember as a kid looking at the globe, and you see that every country has a different color and the boundaries are set, and then there was the picture of the Earth from the astronauts, and it's like, where are the lines, right? Where are all the colors? Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the work that you've done? So you did that work translating for asylum applications at the border. You've also been involved in the new sanctuary movement. Can you talk a little bit about that? How does it differ from the old sanctuary movement?
That is a good question. I believe the new sanctuary movement started in the early aughts, and that's who I was working with when I was doing these asylum applications. And the particular branch of it that I was working with, I believe that there were other branches that kind of started up and then died out, but the branch of it that I was working with was in New York City, and they did a lot of court accompaniment and sort of ICE check and accompaniment for people who were called in with notices to appear and things like that, but those were usually during the workday. I was working at the time and couldn't make it, but they had this clinic that happened after work on Tuesdays. And so I was living in New York. I would leave my little email desk job and kind of walk a couple blocks south to Judson Memorial Church, which is right on Washington Square Park. It's kind of this legendary, I don't know what denomination they are, like kind of Episcopalian lefty. When I started going to this, they were like, Yoko Ono goes to this church. So like, that's kind of the vibe. It's Yoko Ono's church. And
the music must have been really strange
bet.
if it's Yoko Ono's church. Anyway.
And so we were in the basement of that church week after week. We had NYU law students who were also kind of coming from the building next door. We had a bunch of old, like sort of New York old school, like lefty people were coming in who were just kind of like, yeah, this is what I do now. Like, I'm retired and I come to this clinic and I help people fill out asylum applications. There were other young people like me. It was just kind of like this little slice of New York City folks. And then sort of the doors would open and all of these people would be waiting in line, and you'd work with the same person over a couple of different weeks. But the clinic was really led by or organized by, the larger work of the New Sanctuary Coalition was organized by pastors from Judson and from other churches as well. It was sort of housed in Judson, but I think had a larger appeal. And then when I ended up going with New Sanctuary Coalition to the border, we also had a bunch of clergy that were there at the same time that were, again, coming from a bunch of different, like Manhattan specifically churches. So like Riverside Church and New Collegiate. And like, these were all things that were vaguely familiar to me as a person who had been living in New York for a couple of years. But it's not totally church-based in the way that I feel like I've read that the old sanctuary movement was, where it was just extremely like, this congregation is deciding to do this work as a whole. It was a little more like grabbing people from different congregations across the city, but it was still very faith-based in a lot of ways.
Okay, yeah, so faith is one of the words in the subtitle. Talk a little bit about that. What was your experience of the faith of the asylum seekers? How did it impact your own faith journey?
Yeah. I came into this work at a moment where I was not particularly religious. I'd been raised evangelical and had some pretty strong negative feelings about that. And this was right after college. I had kind of been able to sort of make my own decisions around going to church and faith and things like that, and had moved away from it. And then in doing this work, you're talking to people, you end up having these long conversations with them about like the worst things that have ever happened to them, some of the worst things you've ever heard happening to people, full stop. And they'll be like, but God kept me safe and God protected me. And I'm like, did he? Like, you went through some stuff. Like, this is not, I would not consider your life blessed, honestly. But they'd be like, no, I'm alive. I'm here. I made it all the way here. I found these people who are helping me. And it was like, okay, this is a different framing than what I'm used to. And it was, I think, asylum seekers' faith and talking to folks who were really just had a radically different view and definition of things like gratitude and faith than I did, and talking to also other volunteers who are also coming at it out of like a sense of faith-based obligation, out of a sense of welcoming the stranger, out of a sense of, this is my responsibility as a Christian. And I feel like a lot of the churches that I grew up in, your responsibility as a Christian kind of started and ended at voting Republican. And I was like, there's got to be more to it than this. Like, are we seeing what's going on? Like, what? This doesn't feel like everything that we're called to, but I don't really understand the church as calling us to that because no one in my church is talking about it like that. And so it was just suddenly like, oh, this is your faith, your Christianity can be something that calls you to this kind of work that I feel called to. What does that mean about my relationship with my own Christianity?
So that certainly seems to be the narrative these days, that Christians are against migrants. Whereas, a lot of, as you point out in the book, a lot of the stories from the Bible have to do with migration, and they tend to be pretty pro-migrant.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, and I think it's one of those things also that if you, particularly in the past administration, this has been less of a thing, but you had Trump administration officials coming on news programs and using the Bible to justify their anti-migrant sort of policy and politics, which is a little problematic on a couple of different levels. Primarily the, I think, pretty blatant misreading of scripture, but I think also it was very, you got on the ground and you got like into the movement and you were like, wait, like literally half of these people are clergy. Like what do you mean Christians are against the migrant? And I feel like you see that today when you're looking, at the Broadview protests here in Chicago. Like so much of that is clergy, is people who are there out of explicit religious conviction, faith, feeling that this is where they're meant to be. This is what they're called for.
Yeah, right. Can you talk about particular, you said this is a misreading of the scriptures. Can you talk about specific scriptural passages that can support migrants?
I'm a little less good at the specifics, to be totally honest.
Well, you talk about Exodus in your book, for example.
Yeah,
right?
I feel like Exodus is a whole group of people kind of being called to migrate, being called to the promise of a better life, being called to set themselves up in a new land, and they do so, and God is watching them, and God is taking care of them. And the way that you know that is because they make it there. They make it there through signs and miracles. And you talk to so many of these people who have made it here, and they have seen signs and miracles. Like, they have experienced, you know, the hand of God coming down and saying, like, nope, you're going to make it through. And that's not something you should discount. I also, you know, you're looking at the flight, like literally the flight of Jesus and Mary into Egypt.
Egypt.
Yes, is a very, like, that is literally, if those people came to the U.S. today, well, maybe not today, but 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and applied for asylum, you'd be like, yep, that is classic political asylum. Like, they left their country in fear of, because of a credible fear of persecution against their child's life. They are here now asking for asylum. Like, yes, we're granting them asylum. Like, it's very, very classic.
Yeah, Jesus is a refugee, for
Exactly.
sure. Yeah, right. Yeah, so you've also, like the other night when you gave your talk, you talked about a mass that you had gone to at the border and had some reflections on the Eucharist. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this was an experience that I had where it was mass right on the border wall, literally, and it was a bilingual, binational mass. So we were on one side of the border wall, and on the other side of the border wall, there is, I think, like a little national or state park kind of right along the beach there. And they would set up over there, and they would hook up their service to boom boxes, and they would do their service in English over there. And on the Mexico side of the border where we were, there was also a little park next to a beach, and there would be a little service in Spanish. And part of that service, part of that mass was to take the Eucharist. And I think when I first saw it, I was like, that feels messed up to take the Eucharist here. It feels complicated and difficult. It feels like it's sanctifying this place that feels broken and messy and like fundamentally unjust. And like, what does it mean to bring a Eucharistic service into here? And I think that is the version of it that sort of made it into the book. And I think that one of the weird things about having a book out in the world is that it's very much like, these are my thoughts, and they're set in stone almost. But like, my mind has changed since then. My feelings have changed. And I think one of the ways in which they've done so is looking at that border Eucharist less as like a sanctification of a difficult thing, and more like a light in a difficult place, more like a place where we can all sit around a table and partake in this, remind ourselves and each other of our common humanity and our common divinity, our relationship to the divine, and be in fellowship in that way. And that feels like a really powerful, potent thing to be able to do.
I've seen those images of a mass on both sides of the border where they're giving the Eucharist through the fence, and I find that really powerful too, for just those reasons, that you're recognizing that this border is artificial, and there's other kinds of bodies that are more important than what's being marked by this fence. Yeah, interesting. Can you just tell some stories about people that you met? What kinds of things were they fleeing, and what did you kind of glean from that?
I think kind of the story that I have permission to tell in the book is this woman that I met in Tijuana, and she was there with her partner and her baby. And her baby was just this absolute little roly-poly dumpling, like dimples in her knees, dimples in her cheeks, just adorable. And they just would sit kind of in a corner of the shelter that we had to like eat and hang out in while people were waiting. And they would just coo over, like they were both just smitten with their baby, with each other. They were just this little perfect trio of a family. And they had fled. I think they had actually met in Tijuana and had kind of been there for a little while, was my impression. I'm not totally sure of their backstory. I know she was fleeing from kind of a difficult situation with an ex. I'm not sure what her partner was fleeing. And they were, there was one day where we came into the shelter and it was just, and she looked like she had had a really rough night. And we were like, hey, what's going on? What happens? Like, you look like you didn't sleep at all. And she was like, well, I sent my partner and our baby ahead of time because if they cross the border first, then he counts. We wouldn't be separated by the government and he would get sent to a men's detention center where he would stay indefinitely. Instead, he'll cross over with the baby and be sent to a family detention center where there's not as much room, so they get released a little quicker. And then I'll go over on my own later, and I'll be sent to a women's detention center where there's also not as much room, and I'll get released a little quicker.
Wow.
And so they had made this very, very difficult, very, very conscious decision to separate themselves in order to ensure that everyone could kind of get out and be safe and on, like, together. And she was like, so now I'm just going to wait here for a little bit until I hear that they're out before I cross over myself. And so we spent a bunch of time with her. She would just kind of come to the shelter because she didn't really know what else to do with herself and just sort of help out, hand out tamales. By the end of it, she was giving our Know Your Rights talks because she had heard it like 8 times. And she was like, no, listen, I can do this. And she would. And it was a very good Know Your Rights talk. And it was just very, like, I can't even imagine what she went through to do that and to still show up day after day. She was one of those people that I think just needed to have something to do. And so we just kind of watched her go through that. And then on my last day in Tijuana, she was like, I just got the phone call. They're out. I'm going to cross the border. And she did. And she got out probably a week or 2 later and reunited with their family. And we're still friends on Facebook, so I can kind of keep tabs of like where she is and what she's up to. And she's doing really well today. She has, I think, 1 more kid, and is doing well.
Yeah. Well, that's nice, but that's an example of just the difficult kind of decisions that people have to make. You talk about asylum seekers as political prisoners in the book. What do you mean by that?
I think that political prisoners are someone who is saying, they have acted on some fundamental belief about their rights, about their politics, which is usually in some way or another, like, I deserve better treatment than this. I deserve to be able to vote. I deserve to be able to marry who I want, whatever. And they're put into prison for this. Asylum seekers specifically come to the U.S. because they say, I deserve to live a life that's free from prosecution. I deserve to be able to have my political opinions, my life, my ethnicity, whatever it is, and be able to live this out in the world. And when they come to the U.S., more often than not, we are putting them in detention centers for unspecified amounts of time with no real crime having been committed because, usually they're there under the pretext of, like, they've crossed the border illegally and therefore they belong in detention. When in reality, crossing the border illegally is I think it's like a misdemeanor. Someone was like, it's the same thing as doing like light tax fraud is sort of the level of crime that you're talking about here. Like, it hurts no one. It is, I want to say, like a misdemeanor. Like, it's not really a long prison time kind of a thing.
But the asylum seekers haven't even broken the law, right?
No,
they've just come
you have the
and
right
asked for asylum.
to ask for asylum as soon as you cross the border, and most of these people do. Whether they get listened to or not is a completely different story. But usually they kind of get thrown in the system, and they are treated in such a horrifyingly criminal way. I have talked to folks who were like, yeah, I crossed the border. I was at a processing center on the border for a little while. And then I was put on a plane in arm and leg shackles and flown to a separate place where I was again in detention for a little while and like had to go through all of the indignities of basically prison, including prison food, head counts, things like poor medical care. I know people who have gone into detention centers who were not disabled and came out disabled. People who have gone into diabetic crisis because of the food quality that is served there. People who have gone into immigration detention with some kind of chronic condition or some kind of like thing that needs actual real medical care, like cancer or something, and come out in such a state that like it's impossible to do anything for them anymore because they've just been medically neglected for months. And so we're putting people into situations that actively make their lives worse when they have committed no crime, when they are just asking for safety. And I think that that kind of makes them political prisoners.
Okay, so safety, what kinds of situations are they fleeing in Central and South America?
It really depends on where you're from. A lot of folks, I was working a lot with Venezuelan folks in the kind of towards the latter end, like a little bit after the pandemic. And those were folks who were fleeing economic collapse, like not being able to pay for groceries, like at any level, massive inflation, things like that. And then when they would go protest, there would be people who, like, there would be armed federal guards in the street who would try to kill them, shoot them. I talked to a lot of people who were involved in the student protest movement who, like, had seen their co-protesters murdered in front of them by government forces. And they were like, I can't stay in this country anymore, which is a rational decision, I think. In Central America and Mexico, you are looking at gang and cartel violence mostly. And that is, I think when I first learned about sort of gang and cartel violence, I imagined something very different. But the truth is that the surveillance state that these gangs have in neighborhoods, like they'll know. I met people who were like, I lived in neighborhood A became like, or city A became dangerous for me to stay in because a cartel member wanted me to date him or whatever. And I didn't want to. He threatened to kill me. I knew I had to leave. So I moved all the way to City B to stay with a family member, and they found me within a week. Like, that is the level of sort of surveillance and tracking that is happening that I feel like you don't really get a sense of when you just think of, like, gangs. I feel like I pictured at least street gangs, but it's something a lot more tentacly and intense, I think, than that.
Does the U.S. have any role, any responsibility in creating these conditions?
Oh, yes. So a lot of the migration, we talked about the old sanctuary movement that happened in the 80s, which was helping a lot of people from Central America who were fleeing the dirty wars, which were largely caused by the U.S. kind of meddling in constitutional elections. They would say, you know, like, there's someone who's a little too socialist for our taste, let's swap them out. The government gets thrown into instability, and so people have to flee from war that's happening there. Folks who had fled from these wars, asylum seekers, refugees, end up settling in big cities, places like, I think LA is sort of an epicenter for this, and they ended up forming gangs sort of for self-protection because they would be in neighborhoods that already had a lot of gang activity, and so they would form their own gangs. And so when you look at MS-13, that's actually a gang that started in LA, and then people from that gang are getting arrested for gang activity. They are being deported back to El Salvador, to Honduras, and then the gang sort of takes root over there and starts becoming a bigger and bigger problem in that country. And then what's really funny is that very often you see those same gangs coming back here to the U.S. from people who are fleeing gang violence back in Honduras, El Salvador. And you end up, I believe Valeria Luiselli describes this happening in her book, Tell Me How It Ends. One of the students that she's working with is like, yeah, MS-13 is at my high school in Long Island now because of sort of people who are migrating back. And so it's just kind of this problem that is largely, like, the U.S. is part of that cycle. They're clearly not the only ones sort of responsible for all of this, but they play a significant role in the creation of these gangs, in the instability in these countries that allow these gangs to flourish. It's a very circular kind of a model.
Sure. So the way a lot of Salvadorans ended up in Los Angeles in the first place is because they were fleeing the Civil War that the United States was pouring weapons into in the 1970s and 80s and so on, right? Yeah. Say a little bit about current policy. So you published this book in 2023, and Joe Biden was still president at the time. How have things changed in the meantime, and how else would you write the book if you were writing it today?
I talk about this a little bit in the book. You know, you finish writing a book about a year before it actually comes out, and then they start getting mad at you if you try to change it too much. So most of the sort of policies that are reflected in the book are accurate to about 2022, I would say. But I think that the policies of Joe Biden, I wrote most of the book during the first Trump administration, and then sort of kept an eye on the Biden administration, which was quite frankly a little disappointing. He was not walking back very many of the Trump policies, even when he had the clear mandate to do so. We knew that if Trump ever got reelected, that DACA would be on the chopping block like immediately, and there was very, very little done to protect those people or to expand the program to additional people who need it. Right now, most young people are not actually eligible for DACA because the window to apply for it closed, I think, for people like who are now in their 20s or so, and no subsequent generations have been able to apply. So there's a whole group of young people who would normally be DACA eligible who are not because the program's been shuttered for years. And so I was writing it after a Trump administration that felt like it had radically shifted the window of what was acceptable and acceptable treatment of migrants and had shifted it radically rightwards. And the book came out during a Biden administration that normalized so much of what the first Trump administration had done and kind of made it acceptable and normal. And then now, again, talking about this in November 2025 in Chicago, it feels like it's shifting rightward again, where we have armed federal agents on the streets taking people out of their homes, pulling people off the street, kidnapping people from their court hearings where they're going to comply with the government's instructions. And that just feels like another horrific rightward shift in a way that, again, violates people's human rights, human dignity, and makes things that much more complicated and difficult to sort of claw back and remind us, like, hey, hold on, this is not how we should treat people. This is not what protecting human rights looks like. And I feel like part of the work right now is to say and remind us, like, when the book came out, someone was like, how do you hope this book will live on in 10 years? I'm like, I hope it's obsolete because we fixed all the problems with the border. And that seems increasingly, vanishingly unlikely. I mean, there's still, 7 years left to turn things around, but I think that the way that these policies have become more and more normalized, the way that the sort of window of what feels or is acceptable is difficult. And at the same time, I look around the city and I see all of these different people resisting in all of these different incredibly creative ways. I am on the board of the Midwest Immigration Bond Fund, and we help, raise money to get people out of immigration detention. And since January of this year, we have seen so many cool fundraisers pop up all across the city. Like, I have been to concerts where people were raising money for us. I have seen potters be like, hey, everything that I pull out of the kiln this month, 15% is going to the bond fund. I have seen college students who are like, hey, I draw things on my iPad and I made stickers out of it. If you buy one, I'll donate the proceeds. We've seen t-shirts, we've seen neighborhood get-togethers where, somebody's got the grill going and a cash jar next to it, and everything in that cash jar comes to us at the end of the day. And it's just like, oh, this is one small slice of all of the advocacy that people are doing. I am also seeing protesters at Broadview that are just totally normal, ordinary people who are going out there and like very much putting their bodies on the line for this. And you see that and you're like, okay, most people still believe in human decency. Most people are willing to put their actions, their time, their organizing into making conditions where people can be safe, where people can be, not to have human rights. And I think that gives me a little bit more hope, but it's been a rough couple years.
Yeah. So you mentioned human rights as being the basis of the kind of moral argument here. So rather than thinking in terms of national rights, this is the rights that pertain to the citizens of this country, or racial rights, I suppose. The asylum seekers, I guess, the number of asylum refugees that we're going to take has been reduced from 120,000 to 7,500, and most of them apparently are going to be white South Africans. So rather than thinking in national or racial terms, you're thinking in human terms, like these are rights that belong to people as human.
Yes, I think that there is an inherent right to dignity. There is an inherent right and just sort of human impulse to movement and migration. It has been a part and a fact of life on this planet since life began. I think that there is so much that is just sort of encoded in personhood that is being violated by the ways that we think about immigration these days. And while I will say that sort of a racial and ethnic co-understanding is what brought me into the work, it was like, I speak Spanish, these people speak Spanish, these people look like my mother, my brother, my sister, the people who I love. It makes it an easier step to figure out how to love them in the same way. I think being in the work and doing the work has made it that much easier to understand. Like, I may not speak that person's language, but I know roughly the contours of like what they have been going through, and I know roughly the contours of what they deserve as a person and what they are looking to get by being here. And how can I be against that? How can I not do everything for this person to have this fullness of self and fullness of dignity?
So if you were in charge of national immigration policy,
Yes.
what would you do? I mean, is it possible for a country to be a nation state, but also respect human rights in the way that you've been talking?
That is a good question. I don't know that I know enough or believe enough in like the concept of the nation state to really be like, oh yeah, that matters more to me than human dignity and the rights of sort of, I don't want to say the rights of the individual because that sounds very like libertarian and weird, but kind of, yeah, the rights of the individual, that in a way that doesn't mean like you have a right to property or you have a right to, I don't know, wealth, but does mean you have a right to self-determination, you have a right to agency. And I think that matters more to me than the idea of a nation state. I also, like, as someone living in the United States in 2025, I'm like, what has the nation state done for me, really? I don't get healthcare from it. I paid a lot of taxes. The roads are pretty bad. Post office is failing. Like, what is the point of a nation state? But I think on a more serious note, I think that it is possible we are spending so much money as a country right now on immigration detention. It costs so much money per day per person to keep someone incarcerated. It costs so much money to fully outfit and arm an ICE agent and send them out onto the streets and have them beat people up. What if we spent that money on welcome centers? What if we spent that money on community English classes? What if we spent that money on healthcare? Like, there are all of these things that we could do to make life warmer and more welcoming for immigrants that would also just benefit our communities generally. Like, if we had healthcare that was cheaper and more available for immigrants, you would want it to be for everyone. You could just do that. If you had community welcome centers that were like, hey, here's how you file taxes, here's the grocery store that you go to, here's how to use your EBT, here's, all of these stupid little bureaucratic logistical things that you kind of need to be a person in the world these days. Not just immigrants would use that. You would have, 20-year-olds being like, hey, this is my first time out of the house and I've never filed taxes before, like, help. There's just all of these programs and things that we could be doing to make life better for everyone that instead we are spending that money on making life worse for a specific group of people.
Scapegoating.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you one more question then, and this all has to do with that kind of vision that you just put forward. On the one hand, you write that you are horrified by my own safety and comfort, but on the other hand, there's all these kind of hopeful messages that come forth in the book. So what's something that gives you hope in this moment that seems very full of anger and scapegoating and so on?
I mean, I feel like I've kind of been talking about it a little bit, which is just the response from people who are safe and comfortable, and the ways that they have been putting themselves forward, trying to extend that safety and comfort. And then I also, through my job right now, I've been talking to people who are recently getting out of detention, who are, we're giving them the option to share their testimony with the public, with members of Congress, and all of them are scared because they're like, I don't know what kind of reprisal would happen, but like, I feel the need to talk about this because I left a lot of other people that I now know and care for in that detention center. And like, we met in there. We all went through the same conditions together. I'm out, they're not. And that needs to change. And I think that kind of bravery and self-sacrifice for someone who has like just regained not even full safety and comfort, but like a sliver of safety and comfort that they did not have last week, to then be like, wait, hold on, what about everyone else? I think that is such an admirable ethic and politics and something to emulate for the rest of us, of like, I have my little bit, and that little bit is going to be enough to enable me to speak up for all the people who don't have this little bit. And that's how we kind of keep escalating it.
Well, thank you so much,
Thank you.
Alejandra. No, this has been really wonderful. So Alejandra Oliva's book, again, is Rivermouth. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.
Near and Far is produced by the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, a research institute focused on Catholicism around the world, with special attention to the Church in the Global South. The center is sponsored by DePaul University, a Catholic university in the Vincentian tradition in Chicago. Production assistance for Near and Far comes from Marlon Aguilar and Karen Kraft. For more information on the center and its activities, look for the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology on the web, Facebook, Twitter, Vimeo, and YouTube.